Until now, we told the story of psychedelia and the counterculture that formed around it, and we focused on the years 1964 to 1971. In the next chapters we shall deal with the legacy of psychedelia, and how it affected the music, culture and politics of the following decades. And we shall begin with the genre that emerged straight out of psychedelia: progressive rock.
Partly fish, partly porpoise, partly baby sperm whale. Am I yours? Are you mine to play with?
Prog rock originated in Britain, in the art schools. As mentioned, after the war, Britain saw itself as a welfare state, which aspired to quickly eradicate the gaps between the classes. Part of it was the New Education Act, which attempted to give good education for all, regardless of class. Instead, it operated on a merit basis, but in a rather authoritarian way. The new education system basically decided the direction your life will take, as at age 11 the kids took tests that determined their skills, and based on that, they were sent to schools that were deemed proper for them. The art schools became the place that took in all the kids who wouldn't fit anywhere else, and the schools attempted to civilize them by teaching them high art. Of course, many of these unruly kids would rather listen to rock and roll and rhythm and blues, and form bands. And so, you got rock and roll kids who also learned some ideas of high art, and they started to bring classical or avant-garde elements into the young style. And in 1967, when psychedelia affected rock and roll to become less up-tempo and more laid-back, they started to weave in elements of the beautiful classical music of the 18th century, before the Romantic movement made it heavier. Some called it Baroque pop, and it laid the foundation for progressive rock.
She said there is no reason, and the truth is plain to see. But I wander through my playing cards, would not let her be.
The first chart, at least to my ears, was a record that topped the British charts for 5 consecutive weeks during the summer of '67, the summer of love. Procol Harum borrowed a musical theme from Bach, turned it into a 4-minute song, added hallucinatory lyrics, and synthesized a new pop formula.
They might just as well be closed. And so it was, as the mirror told his tale, that her face at first just ghostly turned the wider shade of pale.
And on the same week that this record made it to the top of the charts in Britain, Sgt. Pepper made it to the top of the album charts everywhere, and changed the game entirely. The Beatles withdrew into the studio for 6 months to record it, a far cry from their first album that was recorded in 2 days. Along with cutting-edge psychedelic tracks, it also has classically inspired tracks like She's Leaving Home, a piece for voice, harp, and a string quartet. They poured a lot of money into the production, but the end product justified the expense. The music industry realized that there is a market for album-oriented rock and roll, and opened the studios for artists who wanted to express themselves in this format. And as for the artists, the influence of Sgt. Pepper made many of them think of albums as works of art, not just a collection of separate tracks. The idea of a concept album has been around for a while, at least since Frank Sinatra's classic mid-50s albums, but here is where it took over, and became central to rock music. From here on, everything about the album, including the cover, was expected to be part of one unifying concept. The Beatles meant for Sgt. Pepper to be a concept album, but strayed in different directions while creating it, and the end result is an assortment of tracks that are only loosely tied together. The albums that came in its wake brought the idea to full fruition. The band that took the next step was the Moody Blues. The Moody Blues started out in 1964 as a rhythm and blues outfit, but found very little success. In 1966 they changed their roster, bringing in musicians with an art school mentality. In late 1967, the band was asked by their record label, The Ram, to make an album that will be a showcase to its new stereophonic sound, which it called the Ramic sound. For that, they were teamed up with the Philharmonic Orchestra and given the task of recording pop interpretations of classical music favorites to make music that would appeal to both young and old. But the band had other ideas. Without telling the label, they used the time in the studio to record an original album, titled Days of Future Past.
No future fears, this day will last 1,000 years. If you...
The album is constructed so that every track is about a different time of the day, beginning with dawn, through morning and noon, and up to night, but also representing a stage in human life. Dawn is birth, morning is childhood, etc. In what remains to this day the most successful combination of rock and Philharmonic Orchestra, every track dissolves into orchestral music, which takes its musical theme and develops it, weaving it with themes from previous tracks to represent the fabric of life, and finally leading into the next track. The picture that the Moody Blues paint is that we are born with the innate ability to enjoy our existence, but then we are swept by the hectic pace of modern life and lose ourselves in it, wasting our days in work and running after things, instead of reflecting and figuring out what we really want. In the thematic logic of the album, this stage is represented by noon. The afternoon is midlife crisis, when we finally start to self-reflect and search for what we have lost, but by evening we are already too tired, and just run away from ourselves, trying to forget how we've wasted our days. Twilight is a psychedelic track, in which we dream of another world. I let it play for a while, so we can hear the band dissolving into the orchestral background. The orchestra now takes over for about a minute, taking us from twilight into nighttime. The track that closes the album represents night, or dying, in which we lie in white satins and think of all the opportunities we missed during the day, during life. The message of the album is that we should take hold of our life while we are still young, realize that our current culture is making us waste it, and point ourselves in another direction. Rather than spend our time in work, that is, in activity that is done for a purpose different from itself, we should dedicate it to activity that is done for the sake of itself. It is, then, a hippie message. Live for today.
I can't say anymore, 'cause I love you. Yes, I love you. Oh, I love you.
From there, the Moody Blues carried on with similar concept albums, always conveying some countercultural message. But despite being an album-oriented band, they didn't give up on the pop basics, on the 3-minute records. Their albums managed to form the perfect balance, in which every track is a song that stands on its own, but is also part of the bigger whole. Thus, they managed to remain in touch with the moment, with a life that is a succession of unique experiences. They represent what was then termed art rock, music which is still rock and roll in essence, but adopts elements of what was seen as high art. There were other bands that knew how to maintain this balance, but there were also bands whose turn to the classical traditions made them detach from the basic 3 minutes rock and roll, and they were the ones that took us from art rock to prog rock.
A beam of light will fill your head, and you'll remember what's been said by all the good men this world.
Around the time that the Moody Blues released that classic album, the Pink Floyd released the single Apples and Oranges, which we mentioned in chapter 7. We said that this record represents a turn inwards, and away from the focus on fashion and external look that typified British pop. We also said that it represents the beginning of Syd Barrett's mental collapse, the fall of the man who was not just the leader of the band, but also one of the most fashionable people on the scene. On the flip side of the single we find the song Paintbox, written by the keyboardist Rick Wright, which is sung by a man who spends a night in a nightclub and plays the game of being fashionable and impressing others, but feels that he is being phony. The band started to feel that it is no longer part of the pop world.
Sitting in a club with so many fools, playing to rules, trying to impress, but feeling rather empty.
Barrett left the band shortly after, and in his place they brought in the guitarist David Gilmour. Around that time, the band changed its name from The Pink Floyd to just Pink Floyd, and changed its musical style. This was also around the time that bands that regarded themselves as serious no longer wanted to make rock and roll, which was regarded as a juvenile pop style with all the trappings of showbiz, but saw themselves as rock bands. In 1968 they released the album Saucerful of Secrets, and its cover represents their new approach. In contrast with what was customary in albums until then, the faces of the band members are not featured. Until then, the main thing in rock and roll was the artist and the image they presented, and the music was just part of the overall package. Pink Floyd was part of a new mentality, in which music became the central thing. In a novelty move, the band formed a partnership with a young designing company, which would design their album covers from now on. This marked the way for other prog rock bands, which would employ hippie artists to design their covers, adorning them with lively surrealistic imagery. The title track of the album is a 12-minute piece, divided into 4 parts. Extended pieces are something that psychedelia introduced into rock, but this track already shows psychedelia transforming into something else. It isn't like Interstellar Overdrive, the extended piece featured on the band's first album, which is a formless musical experience aimed at keeping the crowd dancing ecstatically throughout. Saucerful of Secrets is more like a sonata, imposing a structure on the music and dividing it into several experiences, using music to tell a story. The first 2 parts sound to my ears like a war. The third part represents things calming down after the war, and the closing part is heavenly elation, perhaps symbolizing the utopia achieved at the end of the struggle. While psychedelia, like every other pop style, offered us ultimate joy in the here and now, Pink Floyd started to rotate towards the old idea that we need to give up on present joys and fight for a more stable heaven that we can allegedly achieve in the future. It seems to be the fate of every musical style. It begins as anti-musical noise, a sound that no one can remain indifferent to, as it generates strong reactions in its listeners. The majority of the public vehemently rejects it, but to a small group of people, mainly youngsters, it represents their inner truth. So the sound expresses something, a certain attitude to life, and the more the style develops, it becomes a new language that finds more and more expressions. But then comes a stage when the language becomes so rich that musicians can start using it to tell stories and extend the musical piece. These stories are understood by all at first, as they use the means of expression that are part of the popular music that everyone knows. But in time, this process ordains that the style detaches from the pop world, until only the musicians and the fans understand what the music says, while the rest of the public loses touch. This is what happened to classical music. This is what happened to jazz, and prog initiated this process in rock as well. But even in this closed world, at least in the beginning, there were some very talented musicians who created albums that any rock fan can enjoy. Robert Fripp is one of the greatest. His electric guitar playing wasn't based on the blues like that of other rock guitarists, but drew ideas from jazz and from the avant-garde of modern classical music. With his band King Crimson, which was made of a changing lineup of trained musicians, he experimented with the rock format like no one did before. The band's debut album, In the Court of the Crimson King, came out in 1969 and practically opened the era of progressive rock. There's still a bit of the psychedelic sound and spirit in it, but this is a new style. Here is a band that thinks in terms of 10-minute pieces, taking rock music away from its 3-minute origins. The music is so brilliant that it's easy to overlook the late 60s angst, terror, and desperation that it conveys. Only in the last track do we wake up from this beautiful nightmare, and there's a feeling of revival, but the world it portrays is still pretty scary. Most prog rock musicians, initially, came from what was known as the Canterbury scene. The city of Canterbury, in Kent, saw the emergence of a unique musical scene, which merged English folk melodies with rock guitar solos and jazz improvisations, and added a touch of English whimsy. It could be at one moment catchy, at another cerebral, then wild, then quirky, all within the same musical piece. The scene produced Soft Machine, Pink Floyd's second-in-command on the British psychedelic scene, but an even more representative band was Caravan. These two bands featured a changing roster of musicians, many of whom went on to play in some of the premier prog rock bands. The move from psychedelia to prog affected a change in the content of the songs, and in hippie consciousness. The lifestyle that they inherited from the beatniks was beginning to lose its charm, drowned in drug abuse and quack mysticism, and the hippies needed new literary inspirations. The field of science fiction and fantasy literature now started to play a more prominent role. Some of it was already influential in psychedelia. For instance, Robert Heinlein's book A Stranger in a Strange Land, telling the story of a human born and raised by Martians, who then comes to Earth and establishes a community in San Francisco, teaching humans a different way of thinking from the rational Western way. Needless to say, this 1961 book was much loved by the San Francisco hippies, who borrowed terms and concepts from it. But in Britain, where prog was happening, it was English fantasy literature that provided the imagery. Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland was of course a favourite, but there was also a newer work, which the generation could claim as its own. J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy, published in the mid-50s, created a fantasy land of creatures that live in harmony with nature, until they are threatened by dark forces that conspire to subjugate nature to their needs, and create a technology that will allow them to rule the world. So the heroes have to unite and fight back to save the harmony. This legend captivated the minds of the hippie youth, and elements of it made their way into psychedelia, into progressive rock, and even into heavy metal. The whimsical spirit of Tolkien's creatures was perfectly in line with the spirit of the Canterbury scene. All of this, again, took place in England. In America, where the tradition of classical music isn't embedded in the culture, progressive rock didn't take hold. Rock musicians who wanted to be more sophisticated sought partnership with jazz musicians, and created what was known as jazz rock fusion. For jazz, fusion represented the moment when its musicians started to explore the possibilities inherent in electric instruments. For rock, fusion was the moment when the improvisatory style of acid rock started to be done by elite jazz improvisers, offering new trips of the mind. The closest thing in America to prog was Frank Zappa, who had vast knowledge and understanding of the worlds of rock and roll, jazz, and avant-garde classical music, and combined them all to create a Dadaist attack on both the pop world and the classical world. Apart from that, America didn't offer much in terms of prog in the 70s. But there was a place that did provide a counter to the Brits. In Germany, the country that produced the greatest composers of classical music, the country in which this music played the biggest part in the formation of the national spirit, this new style enabled the beginning of a cultural revival. German culture lay in ruins since the Nazis completely defiled it, but the rebellious 60s generation started to develop a new consciousness. In music, this manifested in bands that combined rock and jazz with the German avant-garde, and created their own version of progressive rock, which the British press dubbed krautrock. The leading krautrock band was Can, a name chosen because it has meaning in many languages. The name expresses the cosmopolitan nature of the band, its aim to reunite the German spirit with the world, and thus revitalize it. Combining psychedelic jazzy improvisations, German music, ideas they brought from the academy, and an experimental spirit, Can provided the model most krautrock bands try to follow. I've been saying the word avant-garde a lot, but haven't really explained what I mean by it. I am talking about music made by 20th century composers, working in the tradition of classical music, who challenged the basics of this tradition in many ways, creating highly weird and inaccessible music. Psychedelia opened the ears of some rock musicians to this music, and those we mentioned were experimenting with it. But once art rock and prog rock were a thing, many have also tried to tap into the rich legacy of classical music and combine rock with its more accessible forms. In 1969, a Belgian band called Wallace Collection borrowed a couple of melodies from Tchaikovsky to create a pretty piece of dreamy psychedelic pop. Back in England, Greg Lake, who was the original singer and bassist of King Crimson, left the band in 1970 and got together with drummer Carl Palmer and virtuoso keyboardist Keith Emerson, considered the Jimi Hendrix of electric keyboards. This trio, calling itself simply Emerson, Lake and Palmer, offered mainly rock versions of 20th century classical music pieces, or original works that were inspired by this music.
There's no end to my life, no beginning to my death. Death is
This was the negative side of the effect that art schools had on British rockers. They were brought up to think that classical music is serious music, whereas pop is superficial and worthless. So once rock and roll became rock and started to take itself seriously, some of them wanted to make rock that obeys the principles of so-called serious music. The name progressive rock denotes the nature of the music, which isn't simple and cyclical like regular pop tunes, but progresses from one musical idea to the next. But another meaning of it was to show that it represents rock progressing towards more serious realms, when actually, what many prog rock bands offered was a regression. The musical forms that were created in the courtly society of the 18th century have no meaning in the age of mass media. As long as rock and roll expressed itself through 3-minute records, the musical dialogue took place on the radio, in the public sphere, and everyone was aware of it to some extent. But prog rock pieces were too long for radio play, and to hear them you had to buy the album, so it became a closed space. And while the long pieces of bands like Pink Floyd and Jethro Tull were still speaking the language of rock, and could still be understood and say something meaningful, bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer were using electric instruments to speak the archaic language of classical music. In art schools, prog rock musicians learned that every chord and every key have a meaning of their own, and all the other ways in which classical music conveys meaning. But the consciousness that emerged after rock and roll doesn't understand this language, and it is meaningless in our world. Thus, the connection to youth culture was lost. On the other hand, it did open the door to listeners who didn't grow on rock and roll, and the style became quite popular. The years 1972-73 were the peak years of progressive rock, when it produced many classic albums that also sold very well. One of them was Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, an album that is just one piece from beginning to end. Oldfield, a prodigy who was just 20 when the album saw light, said years later that the album expresses the emotional turmoil of his youth, but I doubt many of its listeners hear it that way. It is more likely that they enjoy the blend of sounds, some of them magical, that comprise it. The question is, wouldn't it have been better to use these sounds to create 10 strong and pure pieces, instead of this belabored amalgam? Pop music draws its themes and sounds from everyday life, from the things that are happening in the world at the time. For every moment, it finds the joyful experiences that are unique to it, and expresses them in 3 minutes of pure ecstasy, which is then carried by radio waves and gets everywhere, becoming part of the fabric of life. When a pop record that is conveying a new experience, such as a psychedelic experience, conquers you, it opens a new world before you, and turns your everyday experience into an exciting one. The long compositions of prog rock, on the other hand, do not blend in the commotion of everyday life and draw their rules from it, but create their own rules. To enjoy them, you have to forget about the world outside and dive into the piece, follow its development and understand its inner logic, and hope that at some point it will bring you elation. And so, instead of becoming part of everyday life and making it more exciting, it becomes an escapist experience, which detaches you from everyday life.
Here it comes again. In my soul. Here it comes again.
Unfortunately, not everyone who came out of British psychedelia went in that direction. In 1967, a young mod who called himself Mark Bolan was taken by the Indian classical music played by Ravi Shankar and wanted to create a similar experience in the rock world. Adopting a hippie look, he teamed up with a percussionist who took on the Tolkienian name Steve Peregrine Took to form the duo Tyrannosaurus Rex. They offered a combination of acoustic guitar and bongos, somewhat imitating the sound of sitar and tabla, creating a hazy mystical atmosphere to accompany Bolan's unique imagery of a fantasy land full of fairy tale creatures. The result was quite psychedelic, and they became a cult favorite on the British hippie scene. But in the early 70s, Bolan shocked his hippie fans when he electrified his sound and went back to basic rock and roll, to that thing that the hippies believed we need to progress from. The name of the band was shortened to the catchier T-Rex, and the records became catchier as well, overtaking the pop charts. The content also changed, existing in a modern urban landscape, but Bolan didn't lose his ability to endow his heroes with a mythological dimension, and basically turned London into a fantasy land. A new style was born: glam rock. And it was this style that gave David Bowie the opportunity to set rock on a new path. In his 1969 to 71 albums, which we've already discussed, Bowie established himself as part of the art rock world, and was an introverted singer-songwriter with not much stage presence. His records criticized the counterculture and exposed the delusions it was based on. But at the same time, Bowie also started to develop his own worldview, expressing it through a mixture of pop art, mysticism, science fiction, and Nietzschean philosophy. In several of his tracks, he presumes to speak in the name of the counterculture and articulate the basic tenets of its rebellion. But these tenets are not hippie tenets. Bowie is essentially hijacking the counterculture, taking advantage of the collapse of the hippie ideology in order to point it in another direction. His message was not about peace and love, but about turning human existence into something more heroic, a life full of struggle and elated experiences.
Look out at your children, see their faces in golden rays. Don't kid yourself, they belong to you. They're the start of a calming race. The earth is a bitch, we finished our news. Homo sapiens have outgrown their use.
Bowie's main intuition was that there is nothing stable in existence. The belief that we can find happiness through forming some sort of stable utopia, then, is a false belief. Happiness is actually found at the moment of change, when you transform and become something else, when you switch from one world to the next. To have a happy and heroic life, one must be in control over these changes. Again, he delivers this new message by hijacking the counterculture's message. When the hippies said that they were going to change the world, he implies, they didn't mean that they were going to make the world better, but that through the process of changing, they will find happiness.
And these children that you spit on as they try to change their worlds are immune to your consultations. They're quite aware of what they're going through. Change.
The question is, however, what type of change causes happiness? What is it that can bring about a transformation that generates the ultimate joy? Bowie's answer is, to achieve a happy transformation, you must open yourself up to an alien. That is, to something that comes from another world, whose logic contradicts your own, and gives you the means to express something you feel inside but cannot express with the means your own world gives you. Then you can appropriate those means, synthesize them with elements of your old world, and create something completely new, which breaks all boundaries and thus generates ecstasy. This joyful ecstasy is what we hear in 50s records, when the white youth found a way to express itself with the means provided to it by black music, creating the synthesis called rock and roll. This is also what we hear in the early Beatles, when they synthesized English pop and American rock and roll, and in Bob Dylan when he created the synthesis between folk and rock and roll. Psychedelia diverted rock and roll towards another experience, the psychedelic experience which we've defined in chapters 3 to 5, but now Bowie aimed to bring back the original rock and roll experience. To do that, he needed to find a thing that was alien to the spirit of early 70s culture, and so he appropriated everything that was alien to both the dominant culture and the counterculture. Pop art, the urban realism of the Velvet Underground, the glam of T-Rex, the aesthetics of A Clockwork Orange, Japanese fashion, and the underground gay culture. Synthesizing all of these elements together, he created himself in the figure of the most glamorous of glam rock stars, and called him Ziggy Stardust.
I'm an alligator.
I'm a mama, papa calling for you. I'm a space invader. I'll be a rock and roller bitch for you.
The album The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars came out in mid-1972, and it is a concept album that tells Ziggy's story. The story goes something like this. The album begins with a sense of loss, where we feel that there is no meaning and no future, and no way out of the boring and depressing life. But then comes a message from outer space that an alien called Ziggy Stardust has come to give us a new sound to groove to, a new style of rock and roll that will be our salvation. The youth feel that this alien expresses something that was locked deep inside, and is now set free through the music, and it unites around Ziggy to form a subculture in which it experiences ultimate elation and joy. But this doesn't last, because eventually, the same characteristics that made Ziggy and his lifestyle so appealing cause the subculture to go over the edge. The world of Ziggy and his fans falls apart violently. The dream becomes a nightmare, and the message dies. We find ourselves back where we were at the beginning of the album, but then another alien comes and offers a new message, and we are once again lifted into hope and joy. This is actually an updated version of the story we met in Space Oddity, in which the hero uses a spaceship to escape his old world, experiences happiness for a while, but then mistakenly thinks that it was the spaceship that brought him this joy, so he lets it carry him further and further away, until it carries him to oblivion. This was an allegory to hippie culture, which allowed the drugs and ideology to destroy it. The hippies' mistake, according to Bowie, was that they assumed that the joy that they felt came from connecting to some eternal source, which they should remain dedicated to. And so, they turned their lifestyle into an ideology, when actually, their joy was the result of transcending the boundaries of their world into an unknown space, and this joy is only temporary, and dissipates once the transformation is complete and the new boundaries are formed. The Ziggy fable is a broader parable, about all of those movements that believe that they have found the truth to ensure eternal happiness, and ended in total destruction. But here, Bowie also gives us a clue how we can preserve the happiness. Once we understand that the joy is the result of transformation, we can simply go on transforming. Once our new identity is no longer happy, we must find a new alien that will help us break the boundaries again, and form a new joyful identity. Thus, through perpetual rebellion and change, we can maintain ourselves in a state of happiness. And Bowie implemented his conclusions. When he felt that the Ziggy character no longer brings him joy, he shed him like old skin and adopted a new character. And from there, he went on changing. Once he felt that the old character had lived out its time, he would find an alien sound to appropriate, blend it with his previous sounds, and create a new character. In late 1974, this brought him to appropriate black funk music, and in early 76 he appropriated the electronic sound that came out of the experimentations of krautrock bands. Throughout these changes, his songs kept on discussing all the implications of this ethic of perpetual change, and solved the moral problems that it entails. His fans listened and internalized.
Bending sound,
floating the ocean, lost in my circle.
Bowie, then, came out of art rock, and his glam was sophisticated and arty, but he used it to dismantle hippie rock from within and create a way of life that isn't based on looking for an eternal truth, but on perpetual change. There was another band that combined glam and art rock, namely Roxy Music. They too dismantled hippie rock from within, but they were more ironic and aloof than Bowie, and offered no existential alternatives. On the other hand, their glam was more revolutionary and interesting in the musical sense, and that's mainly thanks to their keyboardist, Brian Eno. Eno wasn't just a keyboardist. All the music of the band was wired to go through his machines before it reached the amps, and he used technology to manipulate it and create a futuristic sound that was amazing for its time. Thanks to Eno, Roxy Music wasn't just one of the leaders of the glam rock style, but also one of the most important prog rock bands. By the mid-70s, the success of prog rock caused many of its musicians to become bloated stadium rockers, putting out grandiose pieces containing extended guitar and drum solos, and employing the new technology of 24-track stereo recordings to fill space with massive musical structures. In response, Eno turned to minimalism, to accentuation of musical ideas. After leaving Roxy Music in '73, he embarked on a solo career, and became prog rock's main theoretician. Along with sometimes collaborator Robert Fripp, Eno was the main reason the prog actually did offer some progress, and even manifested a new musical conception. Like Bowie, he wanted to always recreate the strangeness, the feeling that we are doing something completely novel, by constantly rethinking the way we create music. Eno was the one who started to develop the intellectual language suitable to talking about music that is based on recording, not on written notes. Eno inherited a lot from psychedelia. First, the switch from focusing on melody and harmony, that is, on the way in which notes are organized one after the other or one beside the other, to focusing on the single note. Using electronic synthesizers, he was always in the search of exotic new sounds, and examined how they affected the listener. Secondly, the concentration on the overall sound of the recording. This concentration began in early 60s with producers like Phil Spector, and reached its peak with psychedelia. But now Eno made it self-conscious, announcing that the studio is the most important instrument in rock, and trying out different studios to utilize the sound unique to each of them. Third, the treatment of lyrics is important not in what they express, but in their phonetic effect, meaning that even the sung words became unique sound effects. We can hear the beginning of this with the sequences of imagery in Bob Dylan's mid-60s lyrics, a style that was adopted by psychedelic artists like the Grateful Dead and Jimi Hendrix, and Eno does something similar, making words part of the colorful salad of sounds. Put together, it made his music sound weird and exceptional. Eno was at his most powerful when he collaborated with other rock artists, and unwrapped their energy and theatricality with his ideas. In 1977, he teamed up with David Bowie, who found in Eno's ideas a way to break out of the electronic frost he entered in '76, towards a way of expressing his humanity through electronics. Bowie relocated to Europe in this period, and along with Eno, he combined rock music with the reawakening European art scene. After him, many came to Eno's doorstep, asking him to concoct similar magic with their music. In the late 70s, Eno began to develop a style he called ambient, that is, music of ambience. His ambition was to create music that will blend in the background of everyday life, not demand our attention like rock music does, but work on a subconscious level. There actually was already music that aimed to be background for everyday activity, known as muzak, which was being played in elevators, workplaces, etc. But this music was too noticeable, and the rock and roll generation, to whom music was a religion, hated it. Muzak was music devoid of any excitement, music designed to keep you just awake enough to do your job, and the rock and roll kids saw it as an instrument of a system trying to condition its citizens.
Excuse me, miss. Do you think it might be possible to turn that music down so maybe a couple of the boys could talk?
That music is for everyone, Mr. McMurphy.
Yeah, I know, but you think we might ease it down a little bit so maybe the boys didn't have to shout? Huh?
What you probably don't realize is that we have a lot of old men on this ward who couldn't hear the music if we turned it lower.
The main problem with muzak, said Eno, is that it uses melodies and sounds that are familiar to our ears, so it demands too much attention while giving no gratification. His ambient music, on the other hand, aspired to fill the atmosphere with sounds that will challenge the subconscious. With the baby boomers starting to take over in industry, the ambient pieces that Eno created were actually adopted by some institutes, and inspired other musicians to create similar things, affecting the ambience we live in to this day. The dreamy sound of ambient brought Eno closer to things done by other prog rock artists. For instance, the krautrock band Tangerine Dream, which in the late 60s already started to use synthesizers to create extended soundscapes of slow, soothing music. This is a process that psychedelia underwent as a whole. From the Merry Prankster's approach of constant movement and ecstatic dancing, it turned to Timothy Leary's approach, in which the body remains inanimate and the journey takes place inside the mind. Even the Grateful Dead, the band that was on the Prankster's bus and created the wild improvisational style of early psychedelia, started making music of dreamy self-reflection. Dark Star, released in 1968, signaled the turn. A similar thing happened to Pink Floyd. In the heady psychedelic days of 1966, their signature number was Interstellar Overdrive, an instrumental freak-out that could last 20 minutes or more of improvisations. That piece was designed for dancing, for going wild under the influence of drugs. In 1968, with Gilmour replacing Barrett, they still use space travel as an allegory for a drug trip, but here it takes a slow, brooding, mystical form.
Set the controls for the heart of the sun.
Out of that emerged space rock, long dreamlike pieces full of strange sounds. The listeners are expected to close their eyes and allow themselves to sink into the music, letting it put them in a meditative trance and take them on a voyage through other worlds. One of the leading bands was Gong, formed by David Allen of Soft Machine, whose albums portrayed the life on Planet Gong, a planet inhabited by jolly gnomes, full of phantasmagorical creatures and operating on laws of nature that defy the rules of logic. Or rather, follow the rules of stoners. The songs are sometimes funny and quirky, and sometimes focused on creating otherworldly sounds. In short, it was the Canterbury scene reimagined as an entire planet. In time, naturally, Gong went more and more ambient.
Last warning dial, turning seams, split in fast motion, waves that you ride, just a boast to your pride. If it's food that you're after, the
In the mid-70s, a reaction began against progressive rock, with rock musicians and critics who demanded a return to the roots of rock and roll. The end of '76 saw the rise of punk, as a new generation of teenagers expressed its anger towards the socio-economic situation and its disgruntled feelings towards the content and boring hippie rock, especially prog rock. Punk was a return to the 3-minute records, to the pure experience, to music that is connected to everyday life, and spat at any music that didn't live up to these ideals. Progressive rock was kicked to the sidelines and became a dirty word. The new generation of rock critics that emerged out of punk hated anything that smelled like prog, and slayed it mercilessly. Initially, punk was just pure rock and roll, sped up for even greater effect. But out of punk emerged many artists who took music in new directions, implementing everything they learned from Bowie, and who became known collectively as the new wave of rock. Inside the new wave, there were also lots who wanted to do sophisticated and arty things, albeit in a different way from prog rock. In the sophisticated side of new wave, there were no elongated pieces or complex musical structures. The focus was on creating original sounds. Here, the ideas put forth by Brian Eno and Robert Fripp found fertile ground to grow. In this new world, the prog rock bands had no place, and most of them folded, with only one band left standing and relevant. Pink Floyd, in the 70s, established itself as the leading band of prog rock, and was therefore a primary target for punk musicians and critics, but was strong enough to withstand the attacks. They've been buried before, after Syd Barrett left, but the band under the leadership of Roger Waters persevered through everything. When we talk about rock musicians that express themselves better through albums than through records, there is no better example than Roger Waters, whose every album, either as a songwriter of Pink Floyd or in his solo career, is one lucid statement. And while Waters was responsible for creating the concept and writing the lyrics, the rest of the band created the music together and achieved a unique sound that put them above all else. Instead of the mixture of technology and humanity that typified the early psychedelic stuff, now came a separation. Technology receded to the background, representing the cold inhumanity of the modern world through electronic soundscapes and machine noises, while in the front were vocals and guitars full of emotion and soul, representing humanity struggling against this world. Waters' lyrics also manifested this struggle, and he is one of the few who maintained the hippie rebellion deep into the 70s. Unfortunately, the two-dimensional spirit of Marxism also infiltrated his songs. In 1973, the band brought all of this together to create one of the greatest rock albums of all time. The Dark Side of the Moon begins with the beating of a human heart, showing man in his natural state, but this man is soon overtaken by the modern capitalist world that grinds him to dust. Pink Floyd described this world as a world that sends you on a never-ending race after money and other cravings, a race that enslaves you to a system that uses you for its needs, and never gives you what you actually need, but only offers you meaningless and interchangeable products. This system also divides the world into us and them, in order to send you on needless wars, designed to preserve its power. The ideology behind the album, then, is ordinary neo-Marxism, but done in an original musical way that combines soul and machine. The use of industrial machines in music was one of the things that avant-garde composers introduced, part of what was known as musique concrète. But they never made any piece that became part of our collective consciousness. Pink Floyd show how to do it right. By using the machine as the rhythm section, you can make thrilling rock music. At the end of the album, the pressures of this world bring us to a state of insanity, an issue that haunted the band ever since its former leader went crazy. Once the success of Dark Side of the Moon made Pink Floyd into one of the biggest bands in the world, and finally took them out from under Barrett's shadow, they felt even greater confidence to approach his story, and did so in their next album, Wish You Were Here, which came out in 1975. The centerpiece of the album is Shine On You Crazy Diamond, one of the most celebrated pieces of prog rock, which lasts about 25 minutes, divided into 9 parts, and is an ode to Syd Barrett, the crazy diamond who shone so brightly for a short while, before his light went out. The rest of the album frames it in a more universal context, and is about how the system treats such talents in general. This crazy diamond could have given us a lot, but he was born into a capitalist machine, which hammered into his head since childhood that he must use his talents to gather fortune and fame. And so, when he grows older, he is immediately co-opted into the machine, which uses him to make as much money as possible. After they describe how the industry exploits and then throws away talented artists, Pink Floyd sing the theme song, which is a sort of a dialogue between two sides of the band's spirit. One side mocks Barrett for losing contact with reality, but the other side seemingly represents Barrett mocking the band for selling their soul to the industry and becoming millionaires. The cry "Wish You Were Here" is aimed at Barrett, but is aimed at the band members as well, who got addicted to the good life and lost the revolutionary zeal that is supposed to drive artists. As Waters said, the song could just as well have been called "Wish We Were Here." Either way, the system wins. It either incorporates you, as happened to the band, or it makes you go insane and throws you aside, like it did to Syd. The band's next album gave expression to Waters' anger. Animals, released in 1977, divides humanity into 3 types of people, represented by animals. One type is the pigs, who willingly splash in the capitalist system and enjoy getting rich on the backs of others. Another type is the sheep, who live their lives without thinking, obeying the system, allowing themselves to be exploited without knowing it. The third type, with which he identifies, are the dogs, who live on a leash and pretend to be obedient and work for the system, but deep down they are wild and free animals who dream of liberation. The dogs know that they are slaves, knowledge that brings them anguish, but they need to hide their pain from others and pretend to be sheep. Eventually, the wild dog in him breaks loose and becomes violent, and this gives the pigs an excuse to eliminate him and use his story to warn the sheep not to stray away from the path. The album, then, is highly pessimistic, and the only consolation it offers is love for another person, in which we find solace and shelter from the world. These 3 classic albums were all revolutionary in terms of using recording technology to create a bombastic sound, and the shows that accompanied them were no less impressive, using pyrotechnics to wow the audience. But during the Animals tour, Waters started to feel like a phony. He was singing in the name of the common man against the system, but on stage he was using techniques that would make a fascist dictator envious. At the same time, he was looking around and realizing that the optimism of the 50s and 60s had waned down, and in its place returned fear, desperation, indifference, hate, and racism. While his 60s rock of friends, who vowed to fight against these things, gave up and sank into a comfortable bourgeois life, or into hard drugs. Dutifully, he poured all of that into the band's next album. The Wall, released in late 1979, opens at exactly this point. The protagonist stands on the stage, blasting out bombastic stadium rock, and describing the feeling of charlatanism which overtakes him. From here, he invites us to go on a journey to find out how he got to this point. Side 1 of the double album portrays his childhood, and here we meet what we've been accustomed to hear from Waters, accusing society of destroying our humanity and making us build walls of alienation between us and other people.
All in all, it was all just bricks in the wall.
On side 2, our hero has grown up and became a rebellious and drag-addled rock star, but his relationship with his wife is falling apart. We find him wallowing in self-pity and accusations against his wife, but Waters' irony reveals to us that our hero is quite a hypocrite, and is probably guilty of their fallout more than she is. On side 3, he uses his music to call on the world to break down the walls of indifference and hate, but again we sense the irony and hypocrisy, and that he would do better to look at his own deeds. Waters here chastises himself for dedicating his previous albums to blame society instead of asking where he is wrong, and what can he change in himself to make the world better.
Hey you, out there in the cold, getting lonely, getting old, can you feel me? Hey you, we're standing in the aisles with itchy feet and fading smiles, can you feel me? Hey you, don't help them to bury the light. Don't give in without a fight.
Eventually, the combination of drugs, self-pity, and accusing everyone but himself makes our protagonist lose his compassion, and on side 4 he sets the feelings of anger and hate that were built up inside him loose on the world. He becomes a fascist who uses the rock medium to inflame his fans, and here we reconnect to the beginning of the album and realize that the bombastic stadium rock that we heard signifies a transformation of our hero into a fascist monster. He keeps preaching hate and becomes a far-right leader, but his conscience finally awakens and makes him stop. He puts himself on trial and finds that he is guilty of building the wall just as much as those people he was blaming for all of these years. The final message is that you first have to tear down your own wall, open your heart to others, and only in that way can you change the world for the better. In the show, that was even more grandiose than its predecessors, Pink Floyd built an actual wall between the band and the audience, but blew it up in the end, symbolizing Waters' pledge to never again put himself above his fans. And so, the last important album of progressive rock judged it and found it guilty. The disconnection from rock and roll's roots, the musical swelling, and the artistic pretentiousness have brought it to detach from reality and betray rock's calling. The final accord of the 70s heralded the 80s, in which rock went back to being pop music, expressing itself in 3-minute records and aspiring to represent youth's rebellion against the world. Progressive rock was pronounced dead.